The UK's Department of Business and Trade has set an ambitious target of increasing annual exports to £1 trillion by 2030. To achieve this, they are actively collaborating with businesses across the country to either initiate or expand their international sales efforts. This initiative is focused on exploring global opportunities to maximize export potential. Now, the UK's total trade with Africa was valued at £42.3 billion in 2019, with South Africa, Nigeria, and Egypt among the top African importers of UK goods and services. But how can Africa now take advantage of this ambitious target? And what really is in it for African economies? Now, joining me now is Bolaji Sofoluwe. She is the Group Managing Director of ETK Group, which works to facilitate market entry and business expansion across the continent. Now, ETK Group is also a UK designated export champion, representing a community of UK-based businesses that take pride in exporting their products and services globally. Bolaji, welcome to Business Edge.
Thank you very much, Tolulope, and thank you for having me.
So I want to start with getting into a bit more detail and context on the UK's export targets and what really is driving this ambition. Is it anything beyond Brexit, or is it really tied into that?
I think it is beyond Brexit. One of the things that Brexit did cause was for businesses and the UK government to radically re-strategize around their exports numbers, really. At the moment, the deficit is growing. And so the only way to actually grow the economy tangibly is to increase exports. So this is something that's become a central priority to the British government. And as you probably have heard about the campaign Made in the UK, Sold to the World, the target is £1 trillion. And there's quite a lot that's been put into into making sure that we can achieve this as a country. And I think what's different about the strategy this time is that they've put financing at the heart of the strategy.
Okay, so let's talk about numbers in this, because yes, it's made in the UK, sold to the world, but where does Africa fall into this conversation? And what we do know is that the UK's trade with the continent has fallen in absolute terms. At its height, UK exports to the continent were about £18 billion in 2012, but now amount to about half as much in constant 2020 US dollar terms. But this is also around the time that the GDP of the African continent was growing by more than 20% over the same period. In share terms, the UK accounted for about 7% of all African exports in 1997 before falling to 3.2% in 2012 and now accounts for just 2.1% of the continent's imports. The UK has also become less important as a destination for Africa's own exports, with the UK now accounting for just 2.6% of Africa's exports, down from 4.4% in 2013 and 5.9% in 2001. So do you think the UK is really ready to be intentional about how it trades with the continent? Because those figures put it as, it seems both of us have moved on from this relationship.
You put that very, in the exact same way I was going to put it, sort of bringing out most of those statistics, because if you look at it on paper, it seems as if the relationship is falling away rather than growing. And from my perspective, I've seen that the UK's export strategy to Africa specifically has been kind of uninspired. It's still sort of falling into the trap of looking at iron and ores and metals and that sort of thing, rather than looking at how Africa's economy, country by country, has completely diversified. There's new innovations that can be exported out of the continent. And even when looking at importing, sort of exporting to Africa, we're still looking at the same old things that we used to export before. So one of the key areas that we are looking at as a business, working with the government as export champions, is maybe adding a little bit more inspiration to their export strategy to Africa. And to add to that, the UK government has now initiated something called the Growth Gateway, which is an FCDO, which is the Foreign Commonwealth Development Office initiative to increase exports out of Africa to the UK. And they've actually said that for just fruits and vegetables alone, that export potential for African businesses sits at around £10 billion. So there's actually an opportunity to increase those flows both ways.
And I like the flows both ways because that's going to be where we hopefully wrap up this conversation. But in terms of looking at the factors that make African markets attractive, and I like the fact that you said African economies separately, individually have been diversifying because there's this often wrong approach into looking at the continent as this homogeneous economy. And it's really not that. We just had a conversation about the top, Nigeria maintaining its position as the largest economy here on the continent, looking, of course, at these other countries that are nipping at Nigeria's heels. But when it comes to African markets being attractive to UK businesses, what are UK businesses looking for? What are they seeing that is putting Africa and African economies, again, on the map for them?
That's well spotted, actually. I think one of the things that the UK government is looking, UK businesses, and I'm going to talk on behalf of businesses really, because we interact with them quite a lot. First of all, education is actually top of the list for British businesses that are looking at expanding into Africa. And they're not looking at it from the perspective of just bringing African students out to the UK. They're looking at collaborative measures, so setting up institutions in Africa to train Africans in Africa, collaborating on knowledge and expertise and innovation to make that happen. And that, for me, is a big leap. From what was previously available, where you just had businesses coming to get students to come and study in the UK. So that's one very creative area that we're seeing some change. And then when it comes to heavy industry and manufacturing, that's another thing. Countries like Morocco are a very attractive destination for heavy industrial companies that are looking at setting up regional manufacturing entities, because we saw during the pandemic that China being in the Far East was, completely shut down, and it completely disrupted international supply chains. So they're looking for nearshore manufacturing, and Morocco is just the best destination for them because it's close to the continent of Europe. So we're seeing all of these kind of diversifications going on, more collaborations on the ground, and creating actual commercial activity within Africa, which will enable us to actually grow our own industries and thereby be able to start exporting globally.
So let's flip this conversation around a little bit. As you say, you work with UK businesses in terms of exporting to the continent and even globally. What advice would you offer for African businesses who are looking to increase their exports to the UK market? There's also a market on that side of things, even though we know traditionally there's this trade imbalance when it comes to how the trade flows and the revenue and the profit moves between the UK and African economy. So how do we increase our own exports and take suitable advantage, mutually benefit from this relationship?
Interestingly enough, that's one of the reasons that I am currently in Lagos. I'm coming to speak to exporters here in Lagos about their potential for exporting, not just to the UK, but across Africa. I think first things first, we have to prioritize quality. If we're going to export into global markets, we need to make sure that our products are competitive. And competitiveness is also, apart from price, quality is central to our competitiveness in global markets. And then we need to focus on transparency. Things like, traceability, our rules of origin, and all of those things, all of those technical trade terms that we need to be aware of is something that we need to incorporate as well. And then I always say plan. A business plan is not an export plan. An export plan is an incorporation within a business plan. So if you try to export, make sure that the core of your business is strong enough to do so, because when it comes to things like marketing, compliance and regulation, those things are expensive in international markets. So just make sure that you've planned to be able to do so. And finally, approach your bank. People, I think, are, very skeptical about approaching financial institutions, but there is funding and availability there to sort of discuss how you can, export into new markets at a reduced risk by using documents and other trade instruments to make that happen.
So I think your answer takes me naturally to a question about the challenges that African businesses may encounter when they try to export to the UK markets. And in terms of strategy, you've already put a strategy. An export plan is not a business plan. It's just part of something that goes into that. But what are the challenges do you think that African businesses need to anticipate if they're attempting to really penetrate into the UK market?
Okay, so it depends on what they're selling to the UK market. So if it's fresh produce, for instance, we can't get enough of that. So you would most likely have a market for fresh produce, but you do have to have global certifications in place to be able to sell to the big players, to the big buyers. So if you're looking, most people say, oh, I want to be on the shelves of major supermarkets across the UK, but there's several hoops that you need to go through to make sure that your products would actually be accepted onto the shelves of those supermarkets. And compliance and regulation is such a big thing. And I think that's one of the challenges that people face, because some of these international certifications are quite expensive. And then access to the market, access to the buyers in these markets is also another big challenge that people face. The communication lines are rarely wide open, and it's we have someone in our team who used to be a buyer for some major brands in the UK, and he's explained to many of our customers here in Africa just all the steps that they need to take to be able to go in. So you need to plan effectively to be able to do that, because those are some of the challenges that people experience when looking at going into the UK.
All right, Bolaji, finally, because of time, we do know that there have been changes in this landscape, both for the UK and, of course, other countries as well. But in terms of the global economic landscape, particularly post-pandemic, the dynamics of trade between the UK and African countries, how has that changed? How has that also been influenced by all the things that we're seeing that have happened in the past 2-3 years, starting from COVID-19, Brexit, of course, even Russia-Ukraine crisis as well, and this global tension we have between countries?
I think, just to sort of step from a political conversation and discussion about the UK's new relationship with Africa, I think I'll just focus on the fact that at the moment, the UK is really trying to re-establish relationships, particularly with Anglophone countries. I think in the past, there's been a lack of trust between both parties. And I think they're trying to mend that through diplomatic channels, through opening up new opportunities, like I said, from a funding point of view, and also through using business-to-business transactions to mend those bridges that have been broken in the past. But I think most importantly, just to your question, I think the UK is open for business relationships. Next year, there's a UK-Africa Investment Summit. There is a dedicated trade commissioner for Africa, and also they're regionalizing through their outposts. And I think Africa needs to do that as well. I think when you look at the embassies and high commissions for African countries in the UK, they're not selling hard enough. They're not positioning African brands hard enough. And that really needs to happen to create an equitable relationship.
All right, well, Ajay, I know this is only the beginning of our conversations as we see that development happen. So I'll say thank you here because of our time, but definitely expect to be seeing you sometime soon.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And my final guest was Bolaji Sofoluwe. She's the Group Managing Director of ETK Group. And that brings us to the end of Business Edge for today. Don't forget to follow us on social media. We are at News Central TV. We have a website. We also have a mobile app that you can download and, of course, stay up to date with us. 12 p.m. West African time, you get News Central Now coming your way with all the latest from here in Nigeria, across the continent, and beyond. I'm Tolulope. Adeleru-Balogun. Do have a fantastic day.